I'm Aaron David Miller, and this is Carnegie Connects. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. I truly hope you're safe, sound, and very healthy. I'm Aaron David Miller, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and welcome to Carnegie Connect, a set of virtual discussions, at least for now, on critical issues of great importance to America and to the world. Today, I'm truly honored and pleased to host two of my extraordinarily talented Carnegie colleagues in a discussion of the Biden Democracy Summit and the general state and fate of democracy in the world. Let me introduce them, although I will say this at least twice during the course of this presentation. These short bios do nothing to capture the full range of their talents. They truly are stars. Frances Brown is a senior fellow and co-director of Carnegie's Democracy, Conflict, and Governance program. Previously worked at the White House, USAID, and in non-governmental organizations. She writes on conflict governance and U.S. foreign policy. Rachel Kleinfeld is a senior fellow in the same program, Democracy, Conflict, and Governance, where she focuses on issues of rule of law, security, and governance in post-conflict countries, fragile states, and states in transition. So we have with us two experts who can comment both on the state and fate of democracy here at home, as well as democracy abroad. And the timing for this Carnegie Next couldn't be better. We're on the eve of the Biden administration's Summit for Democracy, a virtual gathering of, I believe, 110 countries this year, and next, in the so-called Year of Action, in-person gathering. And the meeting is occurring, sadly, against the backdrop of what Freedom House calls a sort of global recession in democratic life worldwide now for the 15th straight year. And finally, it occurs against the backdrop of an acute challenge, I suspect, I know, in challenges to America's democratic practices and the future of a healthy democracy in the Republic. Let's start with the summit. And Frances, I want to start with you. The idea of a gathering or the use of democracy in American foreign policy is not new. You had Wilson's making the world safe. You had FDR and Churchill's Atlantic Charter. You have the Community of Democracies in the year 2000. Bush administration toyed with their freedom agenda. Why this summit and why now?
So, Aaron, I think there's a couple answers to that question on why the summit, why now. One answer is, of course, we are at a critical moment for global democracy for all the reasons you've laid out. We are coming off of in the midst of a 15-year global democratic recession, which is troubling. Another answer is that President Biden has said that democracy will be a crucial part of his foreign policy. Secretary Blinken has also said democracy and human rights will be at the center of the State Department's work. The third answer, I would say, is that President Biden made this as a campaign promise. So we are going to have a summit for democracy.
It's called, and over the last year and a half, even during the campaign, I think that the Biden administration and those who would come in toyed with the notion of making this a summit of democracies or a summit for democracy. And they chose quite consciously Summit for Democracy. And if you look at the invitation list, a full 31 of the 110 countries invited, Freedom House ranks as only partly free. So what's the logic of, it's aspirational for sure, for democracy, meaning they're all not democracies. What's the logic of, with 28% of those countries invited who are attending, again, are partly free or non-democratic or liberal, weak democracies. What's the logic here? To move them from one category into another? Again, to you, Frances.
Yeah, I think there are a couple of approaches the administration could have taken here. They could have gone a much more small tent approach with fully consolidated democracies. That is not the approach they took. They opted for, as you say, a bigger tent approach, 110 invitees. Not all are fully consolidated democracies, for sure. I think this is a defensible approach. I think either one could have been credible. But I think the logic here is if you want to have a summit that asks participants to make concrete commitments towards democratic reform, then you need to invite participants in order to ask them to make those commitments. And I think there's a lot of utility in that. Others have certainly parsed the particular invite list, and you've served in government, Aaron, so you know very well that there is no precise science on any summit invite list or any grouping. There are a lot of borderline calls. There's a lot of gray areas, and this will probably come as no news to many who are watching, but intra-governmental conversations end up getting very heated, and there's a lot of considerations that we from the outside don't see. So this is where we've landed. And as you say, it's a mixed bag. The last thing I would say, Aaron, because many have been parsing the exact invite list based on Freedom House or varieties of democracy analyses, is that there's often a data lag in those analyses. So some recent democratic momentum in a place like Zambia may not be captured in previous indices, and that may have also been a consideration when they were putting together the summit. So to me, the bigger question is not, is the invite list the exact right invite list, but instead, now that we've got the invite list, what are we going to do with it to push democracy globally?
Right. I think that's a critical point. And by the way, the obverse is also true. Countries that had shown democratic tendencies over the last year with respect to the lag time have also showed tremendous imperfections. I noticed, for example, Tunisia is not on the list, which leaves only two Middle Eastern countries, Israel and Iraq. And I'm actually quite intrigued why there was a need to add Iraq, given all of Iraq's imperfections. I suspect someone may well have decided not to leave the Israelis as the only democratic polity in the region and needed to include an Arab country. So I think you're right. There are a lot of considerations. Rachel, to you, is there a danger, though, at all? I mean, I worry for a living, so forgive me. Is there a danger at all in legitimizing countries that are invited to this summit who are, to use a term, dinos, democracies in name only? Is there a danger of inviting countries like these who then return without making commitments, that's left till next year, or fulfilling commitments, but legitimizing them?
You know, the problem with any summit is, what's your theory of change? What are you trying to do in order to advance democracy? It's a hard question because we're in a democratic recession. As Francis said, we've been in a democratic recession for 15 years. It seems to be speeding up. It seems to be increasing. And what we're seeing is the democratic recession getting more bold. So what used to be democracies that were backsliding more frequently through elected leaders changing the rules, now we're seeing out and out coups more frequently. And so it's getting more bold, more difficult. What's our theory of change against this emboldened, autocratic, kleptocratic world, and so on? And one theory of change is, let's gather the Avengers. Let's gather the core democracies that we can really count on, and have a phalanx of those countries go out against the world. And that's the small tent approach. The problem with that approach is that even the core democracies are a little wobbly on some of the other countries that you might want them to go up against, because they have economic interests, because they get their oil and gas from another country that they have strategic interests from, and what have you. Democracy is not the only value that countries have in their national interest basket. So there's real problems with that theory of change. The theory of change behind this summit is, let's get these countries together, some of which are democracies that are more consolidated, all of which have things they can work on. As with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, there's kind of this recognition now that the United States and other countries that are more consolidated need work just like the others. Let's all make commitments, and then let's try to get those commitments followed through upon. And that's a perfectly valid theory of change. The problem is, as Francis was just saying right before we went live, democracies can change governments legitimately. And so if those governments change, it's hard to get the next government to necessarily keep the promises of the government that just occurred. And so the follow through is going to be difficult.
Yeah, again, but in a case like India, for example, the Biden administration has been more or less silent on the degradation of democracy in what had been, the world's two largest democracies. The United States and India showed a precipitous decline, again, according to Freedom House, I hope my friend Mike Abramowitz is listening. That's a problem, though, isn't it? I mean, Modi walks away. There's very little criticism. He's revalidated in the Democratic club. So I guess that's a risk that has to be run when you bring hard cases to bear. And if you don't bring hard cases, if you don't address hard cases, let's leave the Russians and the Chinese out of this for a minute, then what's the real substantive value? So let me ask you, Rachel, the summit has three objectives nominally. I guess it's defend against authoritarianism or authoritarians. It's fight corruption. And it's, I guess, promote human rights. Those, I think, are the three nominal goals that are both in the State Department and White House announcements. And the how-to on this is really a heavy lift. How do you go about making this happen? And it's all about leverage to some extent. How do we extract, how do we push things forward? First, Rachel, to you, and then to Francis.
So the U.S. has very little leverage over the domestic activities of other countries. The U.S. has very little leverage over the state activities of our own country. I mean, you point to Modi's India as backsliding. Look at our own country. We've passed 8 anti-protest laws in our states in the last year since the Black Lives Matter protests, 2 right to drive protest laws that say that if you drive into protesters, you can get off on very minor charges. Really significant anti-democratic activities in the electoral field that we've seen and so on. So it's not just Modi's India is what I'm saying. Even within our own country, we're having trouble holding the ring. And how do we get another country to enact democracy? There's moral suasion, but really what there is trying to convince them that there's a reason internally that they need to be concerned about this. We don't have a lot of other leverage other than them deciding internally that they want to do this. And so part of the goal of a summit is going to be trying to up the ante for why these leaders need to be aware of the problems of democracy for them, and trying to make that case to them themselves, that this is in their own self-interest, not just in the United States' interest. And so far as it's just in our interest, really our leverage vis-a-vis the other forces, because this is an area in which there are other forces pushing in other directions. There are kleptocratic countries that are offering their own incentives in another direction, and there are autocratic countries offering incentives in another direction. We're playing a game with more than one player here, and all we can really do is try to convince them that they want to do what we want them to do, and that it's in their self-interest.
I mean, Rachel, I applaud your realism, because I think it's the basis on, looking at the world the way it is, first and foremost, is a critical sine qua non to have any hope of changing it. And the federal system in this country has been a blessing as well as a liability for the reasons that you point out. But we're going to talk plenty in a bit about the quote unquote glass house problem we have in promoting this summit. To you, Francis, on the question of the how to.
Yeah, I think, as Rachel says, our leverage here is modest, but that doesn't mean we can't use the summit to advance some real progress. So I think the theory of the summit is essentially, if it can kickstart momentum, if it can generate some energy towards addressing discrete democratic issues, then it will be a success. But I think it's really important we are clear that is not getting at the entirety of the challenge of the global democratic recession and what the Biden administration has laid out as its mission to help renew democracy globally. First of all, there are myriad countries who are not invited, as we've discussed. We need some kind of theory of the case of how we are pushing them along the democratic spectrum. Second of all, democracy doesn't just happen in summit commitments. Democracy or democratic backsliding is happening now in processes around the world. We've had a record-setting year for coups, as Rachel referenced. We have a number of really important political transitions that will be happening within the next year. We have leaders around the world trying to extend term limits and do other things to extend their power. So there's a lot of democratic action that this summit is not covering. It would be a shame and a mistake if the Biden administration is so focused on summit execution and then summit follow-up that it doesn't pay enough attention to those democratic issues as they unfold. So as the year of action, which is what will happen next, happens, what I'm looking for is two things. One is the actual follow-up on discrete summit commitments and accountability, hoping that we can advance the theory of change that Rachel laid out. And two, what are we doing beyond summit follow-up? Because I think there's a whole host of really important democratic issues that we need to be getting at.
But blame or shame is not an effective tool. Or is it? I mean, one of my former bosses, James Baker, had this notion of leaving a dead cat on the doorstep of the recalcitrant party in an effort basically to, the fear of having the cat laid on your doorstep basically meant that there was leverage there for the United States. If you don't do this, then this may happen. Now, this didn't have to happen in Baker's case. He was pretty successful. But if you're not going to blame or shame countries, and the glasshouse problem is a real problem here, we're probably less credible now than at any time I can remember in terms of pushing our soft power, given our own democratic dysfunction. What about U.S. aid? A long advanced and sought, tricky, fraught instrument.
So you're asking a lot of questions, Aaron, and let me just try to parse a few of them here. So first, the blame, shame, or dead cat. These are actually three different strategies, I would say. There's just moral suasion, saying you're bad. That works less and less well in a world that's breaking down into multiple camps. But it still works in certain areas. So for instance, when the World Bank was doing its Doing Business Index, countries did care about where they were on that, because that wasn't solely about moral feeling. That had to do with their bottom line, and GDP did matter. And so the moral suasion of where they stood on that played a role. You can do similar things with corruption indices and so on. There's a moral area to it, but there's also a business and a GDP area. So I think there's your blame and shame, you're right, is breaking down somewhat in a world in which there's other camps that would like you leave this party and you can go to that party. But there's still a role to play. And countries still, for whatever reason, which I find increasingly hard to understand, they do like to legitimate themselves through elections. They do like to do these huge sham efforts, which take a lot of work.
Right.
It takes a lot of work to steal an election, actually, once you've gone through the effort of putting it out. So there is a role for moral suasion. It is not completely useless, but I agree that it is not as useful. The dead cat scenario, and I prefer my favorite movie with the horse head, but it's a similar, I think, idea.
We're gonna get calls now.
I know. I was trying to clean it up, but that is a threat. That is not moral suasion. A threat is a very different thing. And a threat is saying, we're giving you a warning shot over the bow that if you don't do this or don't do that, there will be repercussions. And that is saying we have leverage of X, Y, and Z format. We can have sanctions. We can have smart sanctions. We can take away carrots. We can give carrots. And we have a lot at our disposal in that format. People still want military aid from the United States. Yes, they can go to Russia and China, but we still have the world's most advanced equipment and training and so on. We have USAID. We have famine aid, which Ethiopia wants right now. There's all sorts of different levers that we can pull diplomatically and so on. So threats of repercussion or threats of loss of carrots is a different thing than just pure moral suasion.
If I can add to that before I know you want to pivot to the glasshouse question, Aaron, and we are excited to go there with you. But very quickly on the blame, shame, dead cat, Rachel's points on moral suasion. I would also add that in some cases, there can be an opportunity to argue for countries' enlightened self-interest towards democracy. This is not always the case, but you've been hearing a lot from the Biden administration recently about this idea that either democracy delivers or democracy must deliver. This idea that democracy is a better system to solve people's problems than authoritarian systems. They're making this argument, as I read it, in particular vis-a-vis citizens of the world who are living under democracies. And they're saying, citizens need to feel that democracies are working for them. but they're also making it vis-a-vis other heads of states of democratic places, saying this can be a better system to deliver results. So there are a number of tacks that can be taken on that front, I think, Aaron. And the last thing I would say is that, of course, not all arguments to other countries happen in public. So we may not know if it is a blame, shame, dead cat, or other approach being taken in totality. There's a lot of tools that happen under the radar screen.
Okay, before we pivot to the glass house, one last question to each of you. If you had to identify one or two metrics to judge whether or not the virtual piece of this is a quote success, or is it just checking something off the whiteboard by December 31st, a campaign commitment, or are there no howlers or embarrassments? One of these countries isn't forced to crack down in a major way next Thursday or this Thursday or Friday, which embarrasses the administration. How would you define success? Or maybe it's not possible. Maybe you need the year of action.
I think the way that this summit has been structured, its success or failure will be totally contingent on what happens during the year of action, and is there indeed action during said year. The things I will be looking for this week include, are the commitments that are laid out by heads of government, are they clear? Are they robust? Are they meaningful? So that will matter. But then really during the year of action, there'll be a couple of questions. Are there clear ways in which civil society can monitor these commitments and feedback these commitments into actual accountability mechanisms? It is not enough to say, civil society will be involved in monitoring. Civil society, go forth and do your good civil society work. That is not going to bring us accountability for these actions. There are parts of this that need to be inherently governmental. If this is a presidential initiative from the US president, it needs to be a US government initiative as well to lay out how accountability will happen. So I think those are the metrics, and they will only unfold over this forthcoming year of action. So I am staying tuned.
Smart and wise. It's a process. Rachel, do you want this question?
No, I have nothing to add to Francis's wise words.
All right. You know, the more I think about this and the more I listen to you, I know a lot about process. Process is another word to describe a problem you can't solve today. And that's basically been the theme of American foreign policy for many, many years. But I think we need an analog to the COP, to the Conference of Parties. There ought to be a conference for democracy every year, because otherwise, you know, nothing in America lasts more than 15 minutes. And I've been a part of enough administrations to know that a lot of things get proposed and then dropped or revisited, but there's very little follow through. So if we're really serious about this, the year of action is going to have to be followed by, how shall I say this, many years of action on this issue.
That is certainly true. And it's worth noting that the administration has said there will be a follow-up summit round 2, which I know all of the working level people in government are already looking forward to another year of summit planning. So they have laid out some mechanism for follow-up.
Okay, yeah, so although Aaron, to your point and to Francis's tone of voice with regards to the looking forward to the summit, you know, some of us didn't want a summit in the first place. Some of us who believed deeply that democracy was in peril internationally thought that a summit wasn't the right way to handle it. It was a campaign promise, and Biden had to keep his campaign promise. But the problem with a summit and the problem with a COP and the COP, the problem with the follow-up is just the vast amount of time it sucks out of the administration and all the other administrations. What we really need is a concerted strategic plan for how to get democracy back on track. That is almost the opposite of a summit. A concerted strategic plan that you execute with allies and that you work with hybrid democracies to get better on and so on is very much not out in public necessarily. It is very much quiet diplomacy. It is discussions. It is parts of it that are public, that are meant to be public, and parts of it that are not, that are meant to be not. And it is most of all deeply thought through with an a focus on getting things done, and getting things done that need to get done in a very short time that this administration has left, frankly. And the summit is going to take away from that. The follow-up summit is going to take away from that. And we're in a democratic recession that's increasingly swift. And so I would hope that the administration itself is starting to put more money into democracy and hopefully put more strategic thinking into democracy. And as well as doing the summit, can do some walking and chewing gum, because this is not strategy. In some ways, this is a sideshow to strategy.
Yeah.
I just have to emphasize that we cannot say it enough. A democracy summit is not a democracy strategy. Our colleague Tom Carruthers and I had a piece a few months ago saying just that, laying out several dilemmas the administration needs to work through. And the concern here is that the summit ends up being seen as an end in and of itself, whereas at best it can be a means towards an end. So yeah. I think this is really crucial.
Well, the late John Lewis, I think, once said that democracy is not a state. Democracy is an act. And I think both of you have confirmed that. So to transition, if Joe Biden were on the call and he was prepared to be brutally honest, he would simply say to all of us, he would say, there's no single foreign policy challenge out there, possible with the possible exception of climate or combination of challenges, that is more dangerous and detrimental to the future of this republic than what is happening here at home. Again, with all due respect, to Mike Abramowitz in Freedom House, the United States continued to experience erosion in democratic practices in 2020. Over the past decade, America's score dropped from 94 to 83 out of 100, among the steepest falls of any country during this period. So, to you, Rachel, mission question impossible. The state and fate of our democratic practice, our traditions, our conventions that, with all their imperfections, have made this a rather extraordinary enterprise with all of its imperfections. Again, how bad is it here?
America has real problems. America's had real problems in the past and also done a lot for democracy. I mean, think about the Helsinki Accords, which were a real high point for international democracy promotion and support. That was a moment in which, in the early 70s, we were still deeply repressing our gay and lesbian population. Stonewall was just happening. We had just passed the Civil Rights Act, and we're still facing a significant amount of violence and rioting from the Civil Rights Act. We actually had the most number of terrorist acts domestically in the early 70s when the Helsinki Act was passed, far surpassing the kind of political violence we're seeing now. And I'm ringing the bell every day about political violence right now because it's skyrocketing, but it's skyrocketing from a point that's nothing like it was in the early 70s. So are we in peril now? Yes, we just passed a slew of anti-protest laws. 19 states have passed laws that make it harder to vote. 4 of those states have passed laws criminalizing election administrations. These are low-paid people who just run the plumbing of elections, and now they might face criminal penalties or go to jail for just doing their jobs. And in Wisconsin, which is not one of the states that passed those laws, there's actually felony charges being contemplated, raised by a sheriff, no less, which suggests the level of politicization that our law enforcement is facing. 2 states have enacted laws that would allow states to override local election. This is bad. But what I'm saying with the Helsinki Accords is that we've been in bad places before, and we've still done a lot for democracy overseas. And that's because these things are very linked. When our democracy suffers, it's in part because other democracies are also suffering, and we're all sort of suffering together. We can't just deal with one without dealing with the other, because the fates of these democracies are linked. And frankly, the ways in which international, transnational anti-democratic action is happening is linked. And so we need to raise the tide at home very much, and we need to raise it abroad at the same time.
Yeah, I have a broader question to ask both of you on that relationship. But Rachel, you study political violence in America, the rise of white nationalist extremism. How serious are the links between groups here who espouse white nationalist extremist replacement theory and those movements elsewhere? We'll get to the issue of predatory authoritarians in a minute in terms of their impact on our democratic function here. But what about the white nationalist movements? I mean, are there linkages that CIA and FBI need to pay attention to, or are paying attention to?
Oh, sure, definitely. I mean, we have had problems with white nationalism since the beginning of our republic, and certainly over the last 150 years. This is a homegrown, deeply rooted phenomena. I do not want to suggest in any way that this is a foreign-brought phenomena.
Right.
You know, white nationalism is deeply American, sadly. All that said, we also have deep transnational ties that move in all directions. So our white nationalists now are seeing a lot of connection with Putin. And Putin has been fueling white nationalism all over the globe, actually. He's been really supportive of this set of beliefs, also of sort of male nationalism or maleness, for lack of a better word. Some of the incel violence and things that we're seeing, anti-women violence and anti-women belief sets are actually the deepest fuel for white national violence. They're very connected. So the people who are committing violence based on race, when you actually look at what's fueling the aggression, it's often aggression against women. So these things are connected. And Russia's very deeply supportive of both those strains of thought, this kind of highly male, highly masculine in a negative sort of toxic masculine way, and white nationalist belief set. And he's exporting it. He's exporting it actually in a way that is very similar to our democracy support, which is interesting and problematic in that he does it through internal groups within countries. So he funds fight clubs, he funds mixed martial arts groups in Eastern Europe, also in America, through a group called RIM. He funds biker groups, basically young men who want to fight. If they're white, Putin is looking for and is looking to support. And we know that some of the white nationalist web servers that are deeply used by white nationalists were used on January 6th, Parler and Gab, the ones connected to what's known as Epic that had a big leak. And so we're now able to look at what some of those leaked files, their back end was really full of holes. And those holes allowed trolling, they allowed bots, and they allowed a lot of information to be amplified through campaigns, through propaganda. We don't know if that was foreign or domestic. We don't know if foreign actors were pushing it or domestic, but there is a linkage to a Russian-owned company that also had the Ministry of Defense of Russia as a client. So people are looking into it, yes.
But you'd both agree, I suspect, that the balance of responsibility for the current state of American democratic dysfunction lies within.
There's plenty of willing fools in America.
Well, no, but it's a systemic issue which involves tribalism, polarization, grievance. I mean, the predators, the authoritarian predators, that ransomware attacks, disinformation, everything that you just alluded to with respect to Putin, that is not where the balance of responsibility lies for the current state of what's happening in our own politics. It accentuates it, it exacerbates it, but it's not driving it. Is that fair? Is that a fair statement?
That's right. I mean, my feeling is that there are plenty of groups here that are very happy to drive this agenda. They're being assisted by propaganda, by divisiveness, by misinformation that may or may not be coming from foreign actors. But
Right.
they're here. You know, we're seeing that in many other countries where Putin is funding very extreme political parties, say in Germany, the AfD or what have you. It adds to trouble in democracies. He's basically just creating trouble, but he's creating trouble out of feelings that are already there. And it's not just Putin. I'm picking on Putin because of the white nationalist ties.
To both of you.
Add to that, when we think about the global democratic recession that we've mentioned a couple of times, yeah, it absolutely is this confluence of factors. There's a lot of challenges from within, the socio-political challenges, deep inequality the sense, again, from citizens that their country, their democracy is not actually solving their problems. So those are the internal factors. Then often we also see some external factors of authoritarians who are happy to take advantage of that. And then finally, some leaders in some countries are very happy to sort of attack the institutions of democracy while still pledging officially commitment to democracy. So there's a big confluence of factors that we've seen over the last 15 years. And then I would just add, this is not news to anyone on this StreamYard yet. The COVID pandemic has really added to a lot of those challenges to democracy, because we have seen pretexts for authoritarians to expand their executive power. We've seen pretexts to clamp down on civil society, on independent media. Obviously, we've seen huge economic challenges. So it's kind of been a perfect storm in the last 18 months of all these factors piling on top of one another globally.
Right. I don't want to lead you to a conclusion, but having worked for Republicans and Democrats and voted for Republicans and Democrats, I'm wondering, the influence of extremist groups notwithstanding, there seems to be a major issue of mainstreaming rhetoric, division, tribalism, particularly with respect to one part of the political spectrum as opposed to the other. If you had to identify a single issue that is driving our own unique democratic recession, could you identify a single factor? How important is mainstreaming? You have elected officials, large numbers of them, largely on the Republican side, who are willing to acquiesce, validate, and in some cases espouse things that we never would have heard a decade ago from mainstream American politicians. How vital a factor is that?
It's hugely important. It's also not something I'm surprised to see. When you see democracies failing anywhere in the world, you see legislators being the least willing to stand up for the institutions, the least brave. It's disturbing, but not surprising. I think in America, we're a funny democracy. We're the oldest democracy in the world. And yet we had an anti-system party for 100 years that was democratic in the South, that was a one-party, used force to keep, used citizen force and used its own state force to keep a one-party rule in the South after Reconstruction for 100 years. And we just went on blithely pretending that we were a fully consolidated democracy with one-party rule in a whole series of states. Now I fear we're facing something that is looking disturbingly similar on the Republican side, which is that a Republican Party is moving toward an anti-system party, is moving toward a party in which a lot of leaders do not seem to be supporting kind of basic democratic tenets because they don't think they can win with a full democratic polity, just like Democrats in the South used to not think they could win if African Americans had the vote. And first of all, I think they're wrong, but I also think that it's really extremely problematic when you have an anti-system party. It's especially problematic in a two-party system. Multi-party systems have anti-system parties and you can vote for someone else. But in two-party systems, if you're a conservative and you don't like the cultural mores of the left, and the cultural mores of the left, as the right is becoming more extreme, the cultural mores of the left are also moving not nearly as extreme, but to a point where, if you're an evangelical Christian who believes certain things, you're not comfortable with some of what is coming out. Well, who are you going to vote for? An anti-system party or this party that doesn't hold any of your beliefs? There's no one else, which is why people like me are pressing for ranked choice voting and ending party primaries and all sorts of things to just give more flavors, because we need this dual party system. When one party moves toward an anti-democratic party, leaves nowhere for all the conservatives who are not necessarily anti-democratic, small, they aren't anti-system, but they're anti the Democratic Party. They need someone to vote for.
Yeah. No, politics becomes binary, Republican, Democrat, or opt out. All right, we have 5 minutes left. I have two big questions since I have two extraordinary minds. Really, this has been a terrific session. I guess, first question, the president's rhetoric has been consistent, but very aspirational. control of the 21st century, as if any single country is going to control the 21st century, is basically a battle between authoritarians and democracies. And it's our job to prove that democracies work. The implicit message, of course, is that authoritarian societies don't, or they don't work as well. Is there a danger in this? I mean, Biden has gone out of his way to say he doesn't want a new Cold War, but is there a danger in dividing the world into Democrats, and dictators, even though there's complexity in both? Is there a danger at all? Is that an effective organizing principle for American foreign policy?
My read of what I've been hearing is, indeed, we've heard this message of this contest of systems, democracies versus authoritarian systems. But then we've also heard pretty loud and clear from the administration, in my view, that there are many transnational challenges that we have to cooperate on. So climate change is number one. It is existential for us. Pandemic disease is also very timely. So as far as the messages coming out, I do think I'm hearing a bit of nuance, and I think that's appropriate. The most critical challenges facing us, we cannot face exclusively as a club of democracies, and I think there's awareness of that. Execution can be a different question, and there are fair questions to be asked. You know, if we are sort of putting forward this idea of a club of democracies, does that undermine other initiatives? But right. I do think any administration, and you know this well, Aaron, has to be able to push forward multiple imperatives at the same time. And from what I see, they're doing that.
Right. John McCain, I had this discussion with him, used to say that our values are our interests and our interests are our values. I would like to believe that that is true in terms of the implementation and practice of American foreign policy, but I will tell both of you, I cannot remember a single instance in 25 years of working for Republican and Democratic administrations where, in effect, our values, human rights, support for democracy, responsibility to protect, took precedence over choices that were made to further our quote-unquote interests, largely with authoritarian or liberal democratic partners, authoritarian or liberal democratic partners. I mean, we talk a really good game, but we've been very short on execution implementation. I mean, do you see it that way, do you see it changing?
My view from the time that I spent in the policy arena, Aaron, is that it's never the case there's one choice A, which is the pro-values choice, and choice B, which is the pro-interest choice. For one thing, our interests are often in countervailing directions. Oftentimes, our security interests go counter to our economic interests on a particular question. So yeah. It is never that simple. You know that very well. And U.S. policy is a mix of public and less public tools and messages that may be a mix of all of those. So I don't quite buy into the interest versus values paradigm anyhow. I will say, however, that this is a ripe moment to rethink a lot of the assumptions we've had on what we think are U.S. interests. So I'll give you one example, which is counterterrorism. Counterterrorism has driven a lot of U.S. foreign policy and has often subjugated democratic concerns vis-a-vis particular countries. So think of Uganda, very important security partner, very underwhelming democratic record or troubling democratic record in recent years. I think we have an opportunity to rethink how we get that balance right vis-a-vis Uganda. I think the same could be said for the changing energy mix and how we viewed many Middle Eastern countries. No longer do we need to be dependent on foreign oil as much. Can we rethink how much we need those interests? So I think it's ripe for a recalibration.
Okay, I think we're out of time. I'd like to conclude with a line from Shakespeare, Henry IV. It's a line Jack Kennedy loved, but any realist would. One character says to the other, "I can summon the spirits from the vasty deep." And the other responds, "But so could any man. The question is, do they come when you call?" And that, in essence, is an issue of American leadership. I still believe that we can lead even on this issue. The question is, when we call, will they come? I want to thank both of you. I've had a lot of fun. I think this was a great session. You know your stuff and you love talking about it. Passion and expertise. It's an unbeatable combination. And to all of those listeners for Carnegie Connects, this will probably be the last session before the end of the year, unless there is some major catastrophe between now and January. I hope there won't be. We have an exciting program set up for the new year, so please continue to tune in. And I think everyone have a happy, healthy holiday season and new year. Thanks again, Rachel, and thanks again, Francis.
Thank you, Aaron.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to Carnegie Connects, a production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Views expressed are those of the host and guest panelists, and not necessarily those of the Carnegie Endowment, which takes no institutional positions on public policy issues. Subscribe to Carnegie Connects on popular platforms such as Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or your favorite podcast platform. Like what you heard today? Learn more at carnegieendowment.org/Carnegie Connects. Tim Martin is our audio engineer, and Catherine Buchanan and Cliff Jayapranada are our executive producers. I'm Aaron David Miller, and until next time, think positive and test negative.